I'm Timothy Watkins, Senior Consultant with Mandiant, based out of Vancouver, Canada. I've been with Mandiant for, I want to say 5 years, just over 5 years now, mostly doing threat modeling, secure SDLC assessments and things in that sort of realm with clients. And Dylan, you want to give a quick intro too?
So my name is Dylan Marcoux, Principal Consultant at Mandiant, based out of Winnipeg. And if you're not from Canada and you don't know where that is, it's right above North Dakota, and it's just about as exciting as North Dakota as well. I've been with Mandiant since 2018, and like Tim, I've been doing a lot of threat modeling, a lot of SDLC application and cloud security, so happy here to share some of our learnings.
Yeah, it's scary that 2018 is 6 years ago. Great, so we're going to talk about threat modeling at scale, a little bit about what is threat modeling, a little bit of a 101 for those who aren't familiar, just like a quick overview before we go into some of the different types of programs and models for programs, if you will, that we've seen, some of the pros and cons, and some of the maturity and roadmap stuff after that. So first up, what is threat modeling? So we've got it highlighted here. Threat modeling seeks to identify security deficiencies in a system. A little shameless plug for Defender's Advantage here, but on page, I got a bookmark here, 112, I like this definition a little bit better. Threat modeling is a process by which potential threats are identified and enumerated, and detection opportunities and countermeasures are developed. And I like that it's a little bit more than just the one sentence we have here. But effectively, to oversimplify, threat modeling is a theoretical brainstorming exercise. Sometimes you even put a little bit of a role play in there with the goal of understanding the bad that could happen and looking for countermeasures to mitigate that. Jumping forward a little bit more on what is, generally, effectively, it's seeking to answer those 4 questions on the right side of the deck here, which is what are we working on or building? What could go wrong? What are we going to do about it? And did we do a good job? And we'll break that down a little bit more. What can be threat modeled? Simply put, anything. Anything can be threat modeled. You can threat model elevators. You can threat model the security system for your building. But for the sake of us in the cyberspace, it's often more applications, platforms, systems, maybe your backup system, cloud landing zone, network, set of processes, or things like that. Cool. So why do we threat model? We got the who, what, why. To understand why we should threat model, we're going to look a little bit of intel, not anything of a deep dive, not what you might have been getting in the other sessions. It's really just to understand what motivates threat actors, how they're targeting our organizations. A little plug for MGens at the bottom there, because that's where we get a lot of our data from or push it out through. But effectively, during our threat models, Dylan and I doing threat models, I would say like 80% of our job is that these days. We're drenching ourselves in intel because we want to understand basically what's out there to inform our scenarios, make sure that our vectors and our scenarios are relevant to what we're dealing with, whether that be an application or system, and that means partnering with our IR teams, our proactive teams, and whatever to make sure it's all up to date and not a James Bond scenario. So with that said, looking at a few data points here, 37% of intrusions last year had a data theft component. I think it was 40% the year before. So it's holding steady that a large chunk of intrusions include a data theft component as the mission objective. So that's when we've determined what they were looking to do, and their primary goal was data theft. On the other side, we see 36% last year had a financial gain as their primary motivator, 2/3 of which was ransomware, which sort of tells us a little bit of the picture here. Financial gain and data theft are clear targets and motivators. To understand a little bit further, we want to look at what sort of threats are emerging, right? And so with that, trends in the data, 316, so over 300 new groups observed groups last year. 220 were new. And so all I'm trying to say here is the threats keep coming and they don't stop coming. And we want to stay on top of that. I don't want to keep shamelessly plugging the book, but there's a quote at the front from Kevin Mandia himself. You should know more about your business, your systems, your topology, your infrastructure than the attacker does. This is an incredible advantage. And that's part of the why. Why do we threat model? We want to stay one step ahead of these groups that keep coming and coming. There's also benefits, not just to keeping an understanding of what's your landscape is, but there's some more tangible benefits, things like preventing issues from reaching production. We've all been there where a production issue happens and it costs a lot more time, resources. Effectively, it costs a lot more when the issue reaches production versus dealing with it further left in our cycles, if you will. And so with that, we also want to understand, another benefit is, as we have here, is analyze. We want to understand what the actual application is or system under model, if you will, so that we can inform other activities like technical testing, threat hunting, etc. It's beyond just the value of maybe the recommendations you might get out of it. From there, we also have prioritize. Here, I basically like to say, we can't apply every control to every system. That would cost a significant amount of money and also annoy everybody. And so threat modeling can sort of point us in the right direction, help us identify better ROI or which areas are higher risk that might need that extra set of controls or more attention. And then the final one here that we've highlighted, there's more, but just to kind of keep it quick, because I know we only have a bit of your time, is to optimize. So we'll point back to this a few times, and we did during our Birds of a Feather yesterday, but culture, right? So spreading the knowledge. There's teams that know more than you. There's teams that know more than me, involving people like Intel, architecture, like I said, IR, those red team people as well, can kind of spread that. Similar to what you might get out of like a tabletop where everybody's coming together and spreading the love. So I won't labor too long on this, but from the perspective of sample findings, it can be effective at uncovering people and process issues, not just the technical oversights and misconfigurations that we might typically look for. For example, data flow issues is one that comes up a lot in task models. So a specific data flow might look perfectly fine, like from a technical perspective. It's got all the right controls that we're expecting it to, like encryption, authentication, all those pieces, along the different connections between the components. But what if the data flow itself is the problem? Maybe there's a human in the loop component of that, or an area, opportunity where we can abstract that data connection away from the browser or whatever it might be, where the human in the loop might be able to do something that they shouldn't. So a config review with technical analysis might not catch that. Something like a pen test might, something like a threat model might allow you to catch that before it even gets developed though. So, all that's a little obvious though on the slide. You've got a lot of things that, you might catch from recommendations and help you build a better system. But there are other benefits too, which is where we get into our post-threat model activities. And I'm getting close to the end of what I'm going to talk about before we hand it over to the scale side. But effectively here is how we can use threat modeling outside of just its direct impact, which is informing other pieces. I'm going to do it one more time and you can't stop me, but in Defender's Advantage on page, I think it's about 111, 110, they outline a threat hunting methodology and pipeline. And it's effectively how do we go from threat hunting from start to finish, right? And in that, threat modeling is right in the middle of like there's step 1, step 2, threat model, step 3, threat hunt. And I love that because it really drives this home, which is that threat hunting teams can use threat modeling to prioritize their efforts to look in areas that would be more likely to be impactful, to be more likely to be realistic scenarios, because if you're familiar with a threat hunt, it can be used to inform their hypothesis. We've also seen it be used frequently for detection use cases. So instead of just looking for the gaps, looking for areas where we might not have thought to detect or monitor for those type of threats. It could also be used because we're looking at processes or business processes in it too, in the threat model, to bridge the gap from technical detection use cases to like those business logic enriched use cases and detections. Timing considerations, when should I threat model? Here, early and often. The sooner we find the bad, the cheaper it is to fix, as I like to say, or the less exposure we have to it as well is another angle to that. That said, you can't threat model as soon as you have your idea, maybe, because you need to have enough information to say what your threat modeling is. So maybe that's design flushed out or early development stages, whereas a new feature is being like inked from a requirements perspective. We also say you should revisit threat models for things like significant architectures, technology changes, but also I would add to that changes in your threat landscape or your threat profile as an organization. That would be another time. So if you have a significant change in that, maybe time to go down the high risk asset list and look at your models again. So now we know a little bit of why we threat model. I'm going to give you a little bit of the quick and dirty why do you threat model, or how do you threat model once. And so that's to give the context before Dylan goes into the how do you threat model many, or how do you do it a little bit more at scale. Now that you actually know why you should threat model, if you didn't before, it'll just be a few minutes on this. I'm not going to go too deep of a dive. So there's a few common methodologies on how you might threat model. Stride is probably the most famous. That said, as you can see from the 4 here and the half a dozen or more other ones, there's no one single perfect way, and that's the fact that we keep getting more models kind of proves that point. But Stride, Pasta, Vast, attack trees, CVSS, Linda. I think there's a billion different ways, and they all have their pros and cons, right? But effectively, a valid process, a valid methodology to use is the one that's going to be repeatable, manageable, and able to identify threats that are relevant and the countermeasures that exist or maybe should exist to protect that asset. Your methodology may change too, or what you choose might change too, depending on what your goals are. So if you're strictly looking for identifying those countermeasures, maybe Stride or something is good for you. But if you're looking to inform your threat hunts or you're driving your use cases, maybe a blended approach or something else might be more relevant. Or maybe, like a blended approach where you build your own methodology, taking the best parts of each, depending on what you're building. Just quickly touching on Stride, because it's probably the most commonly known, or at least the most commonly employed in the industry. Invented by 2 engineers at Microsoft in the 90s. It has sculpted how we think about threat modeling today, I'd say. Don't really need to go too far into it, but we break it down into, or they break it down into 6 categories of types of attacks or vectors to look at. Spoofing, trying to act as someone you're not. Identity, valid credentials from somebody that maybe you stole or whatever it might be. Tampering, so manipulating the data. Reputation, I struggle with this word, I'm not going to try and say it. Disrupt the auditability of the data, so that's like, can we actually log, audit, track what people are doing in the system? Information disclosure. This could be malicious. We always think about that, so someone's stealing data, but also accidental. So think about like an S3 bucket put public by mistake in a misconfiguration. Denial of service, we think about it from a network perspective, but it could also be stopping our business functions or processes and stopping us in those ways. And then elevation of privileges is pretty par for the course. We all know what that is. It's when we're trying to move from an unprivileged user to a privileged one. And so looking at all these different categories, basically what we're doing is, as we see on the next level here, we're going to want to break down the system under model. We want to understand the system under model, which is learning, building that reference model, identifying the critical assets, the data, the components, the connections, collect threat intelligence, so that's pulling it back to what we were just talking about on the threat intel stuff. Understanding the relevant threats, our threat landscape. So I think it was Andrew Close on the Google Threat Intel team called the Cyber Threat Profile, arguably one of the most important documents for a CTI program, which in my opinion includes in your threat modeling program as well too, because that's what tells you what your threat landscape is, what those risks and impact analysis is. That's all part of a threat profile. And that really informs you for things like threat actor motivators. So why would somebody actually care about attacking our system? As well as threat actor impacts. So what would the targets of those motivators be? Well, the why might be to steal data to sell. The data might belong in a database. The how might be steal from the database, but it also might be steal it in transit or scrape it or whatever else they might be able to do, or hijack compute resources or whatever. And then we look at the work through the actual scenarios and attack paths. This is when we dive into Stride or Pass or whatever your methodology is and apply each of those letters that we had on the previous slide to those assets, components, connections, and say, okay, at this point of the puzzle or on this piece of data, what are they going to maybe be able to do to tamper with it or to steal it or whatever it might be. And so then finally, we end off with understanding what those controls are that we have there. So do we have sufficient controls on those targets? Is the database protected? Are the connections here protected? Are they going through some weird paths where the data that we're trying to protect is somehow passing to the end user before getting back to us between our systems or whatever that might be? Do we have enough to detect if somebody is in these systems? And are we capable to respond if they start bypassing those layers of defenses? Depending on the goals, this might also lead to recommendation development, so looking at mitigations, detection use cases, as we've talked about, pointing towards a configuration review or other technical validations where, hey, we've determined we don't know, do we have this control on our bucket? Let's go in and actually check. Let's see if what we're saying is true. And then if we're already in production, then maybe this leads to something like a threat hunt where we're saying, let's see if somebody did what we just said might be possible. And as we said earlier, to simplify this, exact same model. What are we working on? So that's the learn. What could go wrong? I would say that's the collecting the threat intel and building those threat scenarios. What are we doing about it? That's the recommendations. And then, did we do a good job? That's a mixture of the recommendations, so countermeasures, as well as our continual improvements and those other outcomes that we're talking about, like technical validation and the like. So with that, I know for anyone that is familiar with threat modeling is probably saying a bit of an oversimplification, and I really came here to learn about the scaling side of it. And so for that, I'll pass it over to Dylan to talk through the rest.
Sure, thanks Tim. So it's very hard to see on the slide, but just a quick plug that 4 questions that Tim just asked, that's from Adam Shostak. So I just want to make sure that credit is given where credit is due. And also before I get started, just a word of warning, if you're ever doing a talk and somebody offers you a chair to sit in while the other co-presenter is going, please take it up. Otherwise you're going to be standing awkwardly on stage for about 22 minutes. So I would recommend. All right, so how do we go from one to many? So of course, when starting out, there's likely to be no actual threat modeling program. So in this case, threat modeling will happen ad hoc, as opposed to some sort of top-down culture or requirement as part of a process. And when developing a threat model program, we've encountered 2 operating models that can serve as a starting point, or depending on the organization, you can have one evolve into the other. Note here that the operating model can be a blend of these 2 or a spectrum of both, depending on the specific organization. So the 2 models that we're going to talk about today are the centralized model and then the center of excellence model. So what do each of those mean? First, let's start with the centralized model. So under that centralized model, one threat modeling team conducts all of the exercises and is staffed with people who will perform threat modeling on a day-to-day basis. While this may work for the right organization, all requests flowing through one team may also cause bottlenecks within the process, and depending on where threat modeling is integrated with your other organizational processes. I know we did talk a lot about the dev side, but I'm also talking about things like architecture, perhaps risk management, procurement, etc. This could also cause delays in business or development workflows. However, it does allow for very specialized skill and knowledge building. So the team that would be performing all of the threat models has the opportunity to become subject matter experts in this domain, as it is their primary focus. And if the threat modeling functionality is purpose-built, so say a security operations team who does threat modeling to inform what logs they want and what use cases they want, then this operating model can allow that team to focus only on that objective, as opposed to trying to run the gamut a little bit about what Tim was talking about earlier. So if we think about the Center of Excellence model, and yes, that's the correct spelling of center, there is still a centralized team per se, but it is more of a multidisciplined functional group comprised of resources from key areas within the organization. So for example, you'd have engineers, developers, architects, application, cloud security, so on and so forth. These participants would then be responsible for conducting the threat models, and the Center of Excellence allows for a bit more dynamic scalability in conducting the exercises, as team size can grow or shrink as needed based on the requests for threat models that are coming in, and it allows for the addition of subject matter expertise within certain areas as well. So for example, if you have, hey, we're doing a threat model in GCP, well, hey, we have a cloud security team, so let's involve them within this threat model. So under this operating model, I'm going to say model too many times, you can involve the right resources that have that expertise. In addition, this also helps allow for threat modeling champions, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later, concept to shine as you have a method to onboard people into the Center of Excellence. So realistically, the security champions concept from application security, where you have security resources embedded within development teams to make sure those developers are thinking about security. We've tried to take a similar approach where you have those resources embedded, could be the same security champions, could be different resource altogether, but just to make sure that threat modeling is considered by the teams where it should be. But if you have the Center of Excellence, this functional group, if you will, that performs threat modeling, and then you have these champions, that's an on-ramp right into the Center of Excellence, so you can continue to scale that as well. So as we start to expand on this model, when our program would mature, some other points here to consider would be the central team providing some guidance and structure. So this threat model function group, if you will, they can provide training to the teams via those threat model champions or to other resources within the organization. But the project teams themselves eventually, and this is the happy path way further down the line, is that those project teams themselves would be doing the threat modeling in a self-service operating model, and then they would provide the output to this functional group just for validation review, to make sure you followed the process, make sure that you did everything that I, as somebody in the Center of Excellence, would do. This also leads to larger involvement of informed parties who would be good at different things and considering different approaches. So again, this is really just me trying to double down on saying that it's a good idea to have this multidisciplinary group. And then also it spreads the skills and knowledge and has people think about threats in their day-to-day. So in that self-service model or via that threat model champion, or if these, I'm a developer, engineer, and architect participating within a threat model exercise, then I might start to think about this the next time I do my process, and then that way, when you come and say, hey, where's the threat model, or you have to participate in this, I've already thought of everything for you. Okay, so that's a little bit about the different operating models. Let's actually develop a program. So the figure here illustrates a framework that can be used to help set up a program. I'm going to define some of these constructs that we see. So just starting with the left-hand most side here. We first need to define the governance and operating structure. So this includes who owns the program, who's maintaining the program, and who's participating in the program, and more information about how the program will operate. This would be akin to those program models that we just talked about, but it just spells that out completely so everybody participating understands. In addition to this, we're also going to need to define the program requirements. This will outline what is needed to start the program and begin the operations. This would, you consider the requirements from a people, the team's actually doing this, a process, do we have a methodology, do we have a framework for something like this? And then also the technology requirements. How do we track these threat model requests? How do we pull metrics from these, et cetera? So that would all be defined within the requirements. Both of these constructs then define that threat model services box. So this really talks about the threat modeling services that would be conducted. So think about things such as what processes would be followed, what is our actual methodology here, how is a threat model requested, and when would we actually conduct a threat model? So again, trying to make sure that we're getting a large reach within the organization, trying to hook in and integrate into as many processes as where it makes sense for us within our contexts. Along the bottom as well, the supporting functions and supported outcomes, there are other constructs that I did want to talk about. So one is that supporting functions. These are different functions or areas within the organization that can support the execution of threat modeling activities. So what do I mean by that? Threat intelligence, I think, is probably the biggest example, as Tim mentioned earlier. Threat intel is a big part of threat modeling. And if you have a CTI function within your organization, well, you should probably try to involve that team or at least make them aware of what you're doing when you are threat modeling. So then that way they can provide you with the proper information to inform your threat model exercises. And the other one on the right-hand side there is supported outcomes. So actually, yeah, right-hand, cool. Supported outcomes. So this defines what threat modeling output can also be used to do within the organization. So, okay, I've done a threat model. I have some threat scenarios. Depending again on the methodology and what we do within our program, I might have a report. I might have, a bunch of JIRA issues or something like that. But the output can be used by other teams to perform other activities. So one that Tim mentioned and one that he plugged in the book, I won't do that, don't worry, is threat hunting. So I have a bunch of threat scenarios now, so maybe let's go look for these within the organization. I can feed those scenarios to our threat hunt team, and then they can go and discover if somebody has thought of those before I have. So all of these constructs help support the execution of the actual threat model activity itself. So this is typically codified in a methodology to follow, and of course, the execution of the threat model will lead to an output, as I just mentioned, typically findings with remediation suggestions. So lastly, at the top right-hand corner there, feedback and improvements are an important consideration here, just to ensure that we're continually improving the process and workflows. A couple examples here that we have found success with in the past were metrics and feedback forms. So after an exercise, you can pass feedback forms to those that were participating in the actual activity to make sure that, hey, is what we did right? How did you feel about the participation? Are there things that we can improve upon? But then also, on the other hand, you can think about those that would be executing the threat model activities. They should also be able to answer feedback about what can we do better. And then from that metrics side, you can also pull metrics from development teams, architect teams. It depends on the organization, of course, but these are good ways to make sure that we're continually refining and improving the program and methodology that we've built out. Okay, cool. So we made a program, but now what? How do I actually start? So once the program has been defined and documented, there's a few key next steps that need to take place. This first one on implementation and requirements. So our objective here is to ensure that all stakeholders are aware of what we're building and what it means for them either in the short term or long term. So just start to slowly communicate the program for those that haven't been involved yet. Within this step, we also want to ensure that we're taking the framework and turning it into a reality. So we need to ensure that we have the ownership and threat modeling team defined, and those people that are involved are aware of what those responsibilities are. And then of course, we need to make sure that the program requirements that we defined earlier are actually implemented. Otherwise, we have no program effectively. So some exit criteria here to consider, just things that will tell us that we're ready to move into that next step. Is making sure that we've satisfied our people, process, and technology requirements, in addition to having communicated the program to our initial core group of stakeholders. This would be the team conducting the activities. This would also be the program maintainers, realistically anybody involved within the program. Once we have those items established, we now want to start trialing threat modeling and performing training where needed. So I also want to highlight here, we want to start slow, and we also want to incorporate feedback. We don't just want to say, hey, we're open for business. We got this document. Like the threat model program document, we have now implemented these requirements. So let's just do 100 threat models next month. It's not really going to work that way. So we want to start slow, collect and incorporate feedback as we go. We can do this by communicating to the participants who would be directly involved within those exercises themselves, validating that they understand how to threat model, so they understand the process that we're about to follow, what we might require from them, and then that we've also communicated with these one or two teams who we can trial the process with. I'd recommend starting with teams that you have a good working relationship with to get good feedback. I've done a few of these where some of the teams are initially resistant to the program, and while there may be reasons for that, making sure that there is a little less friction can just help with this stage, because then at least you can get feedback that isn't rooted in some sort of, I just don't want to participate in this, I'm not interested in this altogether.
Some traction.
Exactly, get some traction. So some exit criteria to consider here is that we've done at least one threat model under the guise of the program, and any feedback provided should be implemented. So if required, performing a few threat models at this stage can help the team build some comfort with the process and then iron out all the wrinkles that we may have discovered along the way as well. So then finally, at this stage, we can expand the program and functionally open the services for consumption by the wider organization. So at this point, we should be integrated, or at least starting to consider integration with processes where we need to be. So this could be things like I mentioned earlier, architecture processes, development life cycles, et cetera. And then we're receiving threat modeling requests, right? Again, the idea here is just to start slow. The eventual goal will be to that self-service model that I talked about, but we need to just make sure that there are some guardrails imposed at the beginning to make sure that we are threat modeling consistently and complete. Okay, so we have a little bit of a program going now. So